My mom told me, "Your sister should get grandma's necklace because it looks better on a daughter," then expected me to hand over the heirloom she left me. So I said, then maybe she should have been the one grandma trusted. 2 days before my sister's engagement dinner, my mother opened by telling me that my refusal to hand over Grandma Nora's necklace was embarrassing the family. The real problem was that the necklace was already gone from the lockbox in my closet. I stood in my apartment with the empty velvet box in my hand and felt that cold, unreal kind of panic that makes your skin feel too tight. For a second, I kept telling myself that I had probably moved it and forgotten. Then I checked the drawer under the box, then the shoebox in the hall closet, then the kitchen shelf where I kept old papers and spare keys. Nothing. The necklace had been in that lockbox 3 nights earlier because I had checked it after work, mostly out of habit. Mostly because I had spent the last year being weirdly protective of it without fully admitting why. It was not some random pretty piece. It was a heavy old gold necklace with a small sapphire pendant and tiny pearls around the edge, the kind of thing that looked delicate until you held it and realized it had weight and history. My grandmother wore it to every important family event. She wore it to my high school graduation, to my college ceremony, to my parents' anniversary party before everything started getting ugly. And then she wore it less and less as she got older. After she died, the necklace was the one thing everybody suddenly had an opinion about. My mother acted like it belonged in our house because it was a family treasure. My father acted like it should be boxed up and ignored because it made the rest of us emotional. My sister Cassie acted like it was already hers because she was the one who liked to be seen. And me, apparently, I was the person who was supposed to swallow my feelings and hand it over. The thing that made it worse was that Grandma Nora had not been vague about it. She had left it to me specifically in her will, not to Cassie, not to my mother, not to some imaginary future bride in the family. To me. The lawyer had read it out loud in a small office that smelled like old carpet and coffee, and my mother had made this tight smile that looked almost polite until you knew her well enough. She had spent the whole meeting pretending she was not offended. Cassie had cried in the car afterward, but not in a subtle way. She had cried in the way people cry when they want everybody in the parking lot to know they are suffering. At the time, I thought that was the end of it. I should have known better. Cassie got engaged 6 months later. That was when the necklace became a crisis again. She chose a very expensive ring, a very expensive venue, and a very expensive version of herself. She also suddenly started talking a lot about family legacy, tradition, and how important it was that the wedding feel meaningful. The weird part was that none of this had anything to do with Grandma Nora, because Cassie had barely visited her in the last 4 years of her life. I had been the one taking her to appointments. I had been the one picking up prescriptions. I had been the one sitting in a plastic chair in her bedroom while she told me stories about our great-aunt and the house she grew up in and the summer the family lost almost everything. Cassie used to say Grandma was difficult. What she really meant was that Grandma could see through her. I think Grandma knew that even then. When the engagement dinner started getting planned, my mother began dropping hints that the necklace would be a beautiful touch. She said it would photograph well. She said Cassie deserved something old and meaningful. She said family pieces should not just sit in a safe and gather dust. Then she said the part that made me go quiet. She said it looked better on a daughter. I remember staring at her because I honestly thought I had misheard her. I did not. She repeated it with this calm, dismissive confidence that told me she had been thinking it for a while. My father did not defend me. He just kept cutting his food and acting like I was the one making the table awkward. Cassie got this smug little smile that made my stomach turn. I said no, that was it. No big speech. No yelling, just no. I told them Grandma had left it to me and that I was not giving up something she had clearly chosen for me. My mother called me selfish. Cassie said I was making the family look divided. My father said I was turning a sentimental object into a power struggle. That is when I learned, once again, that in my family the person who says no is always the problem. I left dinner early and went home feeling sick. I opened the lockbox that night because I wanted to see the necklace. It was the one thing from Grandma that still made me feel like she had seen me clearly. That is how I found it missing. At first, I thought maybe I had misplaced it. Then I noticed the tiny scratch on the side of the box where the latch had been forced just enough to leave a mark. Then I saw the spare key was also gone. My spare key was kept in the same drawer. I sat down on the kitchen floor and stared at the open box for a long time before I started calling people. Cassie did not answer. My mother answered on the second ring and sounded annoyed before I even explained why I was calling. She said I was being dramatic. She said I should stop accusing my family over one necklace. She said Cassie needed it for the engagement photos and that I would understand once I calmed down. That was the moment my chest went cold. She did not ask why I was upset. She did not pretend to be surprised that it was missing. She talked like the decision had already been made. I asked where it was. She said I would see it on Cassie in a few days, and then she hung up on me. I sat there with my phone in my hand, trying to figure out whether I was furious or just stunned. Then I remembered something small and awful. My mother had been in my apartment 3 weeks earlier while I was at work. She had come by because she was dropping off some old bills from my father and wanted to use my printer. I had not thought much of it then because we had never been the kind of family that respected privacy. Now I remembered that she had spent a long time in my bedroom pretending to admire the clutter. I remembered her glancing at the lockbox on my dresser. I remembered thinking it was weird and then telling myself I was being paranoid. I was not being paranoid. The next morning I went to the property manager and asked for the hallway camera footage. They would not show me anything without a police report, but they did confirm that my mother had used the lobby access code I had given her months earlier for package deliveries. She had gone up to my floor the week before. She had stayed long enough that my neighbors assumed she was helping me with something. I felt the blood drain out of my face when I heard that. I did not want to call the police over a necklace. That sounds absurd when I type it out, but at the time it felt like the kind of thing that would make the family explode permanently. I also still had this stupid little hope that maybe they were bluffing and would return it once they made their point. So I called my Aunt Denise first. Denise was my mother's older sister and the only person in the family who had ever treated me like I was allowed to have my own thoughts. When I told her what happened, she went quiet in a way that scared me. Then she told me that Grandma had changed her will twice. That was the first real revelation, not because I did not know Grandma had revised things, but because I did not know why. Denise told me Grandma had been furious after hearing that Cassie had been telling relatives the necklace would be hers eventually. She said Grandma had specifically added language in the final version because she no longer trusted my parents to respect her wishes. She also said Grandma had been deeply hurt by Cassie skipping most of her appointments and then suddenly acting sentimental after the will was mentioned. That explained a lot. It did not explain the theft. Denise came over that evening with copies of the probate documents she had kept after helping organize some paperwork for my grandmother. She had found a handwritten note tucked inside the folder from the lawyer. It said the necklace was to remain with me unless I voluntarily chose to pass it down later. There was also a line about safeguarding it from pressure, manipulation, and family entitlement. I sat there reading that line over and over. Grandma had known. That part hurt almost as much as the theft. She had known my family would do this to me. She had known they would act like my refusal was a character flaw. She had known they would try to turn her gift into a debate. Denise did not say it out loud, but I could see she was angry enough to shake. She also told me something else that made my stomach drop. A few weeks before Grandma died, Cassie had tried to get access to her jewelry cabinet. Not because she wanted to keep anything, Denise said, but because she had been asking which pieces were worth the most. At the time, I had assumed Cassie was being shallow. Now it looked a lot worse. I decided to call Grandma's lawyer. He was semi-retired, crabby, and very much the type of man who had no patience for family drama. He pulled the will, the codicil, and the inventory. He also confirmed that the necklace was listed with a photograph and a valuation from before Grandma died. Then he asked me if the item had been reported missing. I told him no. He told me I should do that immediately if it was no longer in my possession. That made my hands shake. I hated the idea of police involvement. I hated the idea of turning my family into a case file. But I hated even more the idea that they might actually sell it. Because by then I knew this was not just about Cassie wanting a pretty accessory. Something bigger was happening. My mother had never fought that hard over something sentimental. She fought hard over money. She fought hard when she wanted control. She fought hard when she thought nobody would stop her. So I started looking into my father. It took me 2 days to figure out why they were suddenly so desperate. My father had a failing construction business. Not failing in the dramatic collapse sense. Failing in the slow, ugly, too embarrassed to admit it sense. A couple of his long-term clients had stopped paying on time. A job in the suburbs had gone over budget. He had a line of credit that was almost maxed out. And somehow, because my family could never be normal about anything, they had also helped finance Cassie's wedding like it was a joint investment in the family image. I found that out after calling the venue and pretending I was confirming a payment schedule. The woman I spoke with was polite in the way people are when they can tell there is a problem but do not want to be stuck in it. She accidentally confirmed that a large deposit had been paid by a third party, not Cassie herself. The third party was my father. That meant my parents were already bleeding money and Cassie was helping spend what was left. The necklace made sense now, at least enough to be horrifying. It was not just a family heirloom to them. It was an asset. A nice little liquid thing they could convert if they needed to pretend the wedding and the business and the house were all fine. I felt sick all over again. My mother was not the kind of woman who stole in obvious ways. She stole in ways that could be explained away if you were too tired to fight. She would call it borrowing. She would call it keeping it safe. She would call it honoring family traditions. Then she would act offended that you noticed. I filed the police report that night. I hated every second of it. I also hated how relieved I felt after I did it. The officer who took the report was kind enough, but I still felt ridiculous explaining that my own mother had probably taken a necklace from my apartment. Then he asked if I had any proof, and I had to admit that I did not yet. That is when he told me to focus on the paper trail, so I did. I checked my door camera subscription and discovered that the battery had been removed from the unit sometime during the week my mother visited. I nearly laughed from how obvious that was, not because it was clever. Because it was clumsy, she had not even bothered to be subtle. She had just assumed I would not fight back. I called Cassie's fiancé next, which felt awful, but I needed to know if he knew anything. I had met Mark enough times to know he was not a bad guy. He was just the kind of man who wanted to believe everything around him was stable. That is not a great quality in a man marrying into my family. He answered my questions carefully at first. Then he went silent. Then he admitted that Cassie had mentioned a family necklace and that my mother had assured him it would be used for wedding photos. He sounded confused, which told me he had no idea this was stolen. That was the second major revelation. My sister had not just been letting my parents bully me. She had been carrying the lie into her engagement like it was part of the package. I asked him if Cassie had said anything else. He hesitated long enough for me to know she had. Then he said she had told him Grandma wanted the necklace on the bride in the family because that was how tradition worked. I almost threw up. That was exactly the sort of lie Cassie would tell because it sounded respectful while still being selfish. Mark said he would talk to her. He also said something that I did not fully understand until later. He said there had been a lot of pressure from my parents about keeping the family image clean until after the wedding. I remember that because it sounded weirdly specific. At the time, I did not know it was because they were trying to keep other problems from surfacing. The next morning, Denise came back with another piece of information. Grandma had been secretly seeing a different lawyer near the end of her life because she did not trust the family office to handle everything honestly. The original lawyer had passed her files to the new one, who had made sure the updated will was airtight. That part alone would have been enough to confirm my family was in trouble. But Denise also told me Grandma had left a sealed envelope with instructions to open it if anyone in the family started fighting over the necklace. I had no idea such a thing existed. The envelope was inside a box in Denise's storage unit. I drove there myself. I sat in my car for a full minute before opening it because my hands would not stop shaking. Inside was a note in Grandma's handwriting and a photocopy of a bank statement. The note said she knew my mother had been asking about the necklace's value before she died. The bank statement showed a withdrawal pattern that made no sense at first glance. Then I noticed the dates. The withdrawals matched the months my mother had claimed she was helping Grandma with errands. That was the third major revelation. My mother had been taking money from Grandma before she died. Not a huge dramatic robbery, just enough to avoid attention if nobody checked closely. It was a slow theft, the kind that only works when the victim is too tired, too sick, or too trusting to compare receipts. Grandma had apparently caught on just before she got too weak to confront her properly. She had moved some accounts, changed the will, and tried to protect me and the necklace at the same time. I sat in my car in Denise's parking lot and cried harder than I expected. Not because of the money, because Grandma had been trying to keep me safe from my own family and had probably known she was running out of time to do it. I also understood something ugly in that moment. Cassie had not simply grown entitled on her own. She had been trained. My mother had spent years teaching her that being the favorite meant never really hearing no. My father had backed that up by staying passive whenever the bills got messy. So when Grandma finally left me something important, it broke the system, and they were trying to fix it the only way they knew how. By taking. I spent the rest of that day calling every antique dealer and jewelry buyer within 2 counties. At first, I got nowhere. Then one shop owner sounded weirdly hesitant when I mentioned the necklace description. He asked if I had a police report. I said yes. He told me someone had brought in a matching piece for appraisal and had asked about private sale options. That was the fourth major revelation. The necklace had not just been stolen. It had already been moved to someone willing to turn it into cash. The shop owner refused to name the person without paperwork, but he did give me the appraiser's name. I forwarded everything to the detective handling the report. That should have been enough to make my family back off. It was not. Instead, my father showed up at my apartment the next evening looking tired, cornered, and angry in the way men get when they know they are losing control of a situation they created. He did not come inside right away. He stood in the hall and waited until I opened the door. Then he shoved a folder at me. Inside were copies of bills, a loan notice, and a rough wedding budget with numbers circled in red. He had tried to make the whole thing look rational. That was the problem. He was trying to frame the theft as temporary borrowing for the good of the family. The folder also contained a written statement from him saying the necklace was not supposed to be a public issue. He had clearly expected me to be intimidated by the paperwork. Instead, I asked him why he had not told me the family was in financial trouble. He looked at me like I had asked him why the sky was blue. He said it was none of my business. That told me everything I needed to know. He did not see my inherited property as my business. He saw it as family property he had failed to control. He then tried to explain that Cassie needed the necklace for the wedding and that it would all be put back later. He talked the way he always talked when he wanted me to accept a bad situation, because it was easier for him. I told him I had already filed a police report. That changed his face instantly. Not because he was guilty, although he was, but because now he had to deal with consequences instead of expectation. He left without another word. 20 minutes later, my mother called me 6 times. I ignored all of them. Then she sent a message through Denise saying I was humiliating her and making Grandma look vindictive. That was such an insane thing to say that I almost appreciated the honesty. She was not even pretending this was about the necklace anymore. She was mad that the story was getting out. Mark called me later that night. He sounded shaken. Cassie had finally told him the necklace had been taken from my apartment, but she claimed I had agreed to let her borrow it and then changed my mind out of spite. That was a lie so sloppy I could barely believe she used it. He also said he had asked why she was wearing a necklace that was supposed to have already been in my possession if I had supposedly lent it. She had apparently not thought that far ahead. That was the 5th major revelation. Cassie had built the entire story on the assumption that nobody would question her. Mark said he was beginning to wonder what else he did not know. I did not try to comfort him. I was too busy being furious at all of them. The detective called me the next day and told me the appraiser had confirmed the necklace's value was much higher than anybody in my family had admitted. Not sentimental value, real market value. Apparently the original setting and the sapphire were from a collectible period, and the piece could easily fetch far more than my parents would have made on a quick pawn deal. That explained why my mother had been so eager to grab it. It also explained why she had been acting like the whole thing was trivial. She had been trying to move it before anybody realized what it was actually worth. I went to the family home that weekend for the first time since filing the report. I did not go because I wanted to negotiate. I went because I wanted my grandmother's other papers. I had the sinking feeling that there were more secrets in that house than anyone had admitted. The place looked neat from the outside, but once I was inside, I could feel the stress in the air. There were unopened wine boxes in the dining room. There were wedding favors stacked in the hallway. There was a stack of envelopes on the kitchen table with final notices peeking out from underneath a fruit bowl. Nobody was pretending anymore. My mother tried to act composed. My sister tried to act offended. My father tried to act absent. I asked for Grandma's records and family files. My mother said there was nothing left for me to take. I told her I was not taking anything. I was looking for proof of the theft. That was when Cassie finally cracked and admitted something that changed the shape of the whole mess. Not directly, of course. She never admitted anything directly. She said that Grandma had been confused near the end and that the lawyer probably made a mistake. She said the necklace should have gone to her because it looked more natural on a bride and because everyone had assumed it would someday. That was not a confession, but it was close enough. Then she made the mistake of mentioning that the pawn contact had already been arranged and that the money was supposed to cover the rest of the wedding deposit and some of Dad's business expenses. There it was. The real reason, not family tradition, not sentiment, not even favoritism in the abstract. Debt. They had stolen my inheritance because they were out of money and too proud to admit it. I remember staring at Cassie and feeling something in me go very still. For years I had told myself I was the reasonable one in the family, the one who kept things from exploding, the one who tried to be fair. But in that moment I realized fairness had never been the point. They were not interested in fairness. They were interested in getting what they wanted with the least resistance possible. I left the house and called the detective from my car. The officer had already been in contact with the appraiser and the buyer. By then the necklace had been found in a consignment holding account and frozen before the sale could be completed. That was the 6th major revelation. If I had waited one more week, it might have vanished into private hands forever. My mother had not just stolen it. She had nearly erased it. The detective said I would need to come in and identify it formally. I did that the next morning. When I saw the necklace sitting in an evidence bag, I felt a kind of nausea I had never experienced before. It looked smaller under bright fluorescent lights, meaner somehow. The detective mentioned a second item had been found with it, a folded receipt and a storage key. That key led to a small safe deposit box rented in my father's name. Now we were really in it. The box contained a stack of old family documents, a second jewelry appraisal, and a folder of loan paperwork. My father had apparently been using family items as informal collateral for months, not just the necklace. There was also a small gold bracelet that had belonged to my grandmother, plus some silver flatware he claimed had been misplaced. The paperwork showed he had planned to keep rolling these assets into short-term loans until the business stabilized. That was never going to happen. It was a house of cards built on heirlooms and denial. I felt honestly sick about it, not because the items were valuable, although they were, because my father had looked me in the eye for years and acted like the family was simply going through a rough patch. In reality, he had been quietly pawning our history. When I told Denise, she was furious enough to say things I had never heard her say before. She also made one call to an attorney she knew from church. That is when the seventh major revelation arrived. Grandma had left a separate handwritten memo in her lawyer file explaining that if any family member attempted to sell or borrow against her bequeathed items, the executor was to treat it as deliberate interference with the estate. That memo meant the necklace theft was not just theft. It was a probate violation. It also meant my father might be liable for the other missing pieces. He had thought he was being clever. Grandma had outmaneuvered him from the grave. I will admit something embarrassing here. Part of me still wanted to spare my parents. I know that sounds weak. Maybe it was weak. I had spent so long trying to keep their moods stable that even after all this, I was still reflexively worried about humiliating them. But then I remembered how quickly they had decided my feelings did not matter. So I stopped caring about sparing them. The necklace was returned to me through the detective 2 days later. I had to sign half a dozen forms. I had to listen to a lecture about home security. I had to promise not to use the item in any way that could jeopardize evidence if the case moved forward. I nodded through all of it and drove home with the evidence bag on the passenger seat like it was a living thing. I kept looking at it at red lights. I could not believe I had almost lost it. That night I opened the old velvet box again, only now the necklace was inside it. There was something tucked into the lining that I had never noticed before. A tiny folded note. The writing was Grandma's. It was short. It said she left the necklace to me because I had always returned what others tried to take. I sat at my table and read that line until I could not see it clearly anymore. That was the only time I completely broke down. Not in the middle of the theft, not during the police report, not during the fight. It hit me when I realized Grandma had known me better than I had known myself. She had seen that I would still try to hold the family together even when they did not deserve it, and she had trusted me anyway. The legal side got messier after that. My father tried to claim the necklace had been offered as temporary support for the family business. The detective told him the paper trail did not support that. The lawyer for Grandma's estate sent formal notices. My mother tried to argue that Cassie had merely borrowed it because the family expected the heirloom to stay within the household. The estate lawyer pointed out that the will had already specifically addressed that lie. Cassie, suddenly realizing things were collapsing, started acting like a victim. She said she had not known the necklace had been taken without permission. She said she thought I had agreed. She said our parents had told her the whole thing was sordid. That might have been the first honest thing she said, because she really did seem to believe she could remain innocent if she kept enough distance from the theft. Then Mark asked to see the paperwork. That was the 8th major revelation, and the one that finally broke the wedding apart. He learned the venue deposit had been paid with business money from my father. He learned the necklace had been in a pawn arrangement while Cassie had been planning dress fittings. He learned my mother had been telling relatives the necklace was a family gift when it was actually stolen property. Then he learned about the second safe deposit box and the old loans tied to heirlooms. He ended the engagement less than a week later. I did not celebrate when I heard that. I really did not. I knew enough about family mess to know a breakup like that would hurt a lot of people. But I also knew Cassie had brought him into a lie that was deeper than a wedding accessory. She had expected him to marry into a fantasy and then live with the truth later. That is not how real life works. Once the engagement collapsed, my mother started acting like I had personally ruined Cassie's future. That was rich coming from the woman who had stolen the necklace and lied about it. My father went quieter, which somehow was worse. He had the look of a man who understood the game was lost, but did not know how to admit it. The estate attorney asked me to come in for a meeting about the remaining family pieces. That was when the 9th major revelation came out. Grandma had left a list of items in a separate note with instructions for me to inspect the family home after her death. She had suspected some pieces were already missing. She had written down where they should have been. When the attorney compared the list to the contents of my father's safe deposit box, there were gaps. The missing items were not just random keepsakes. They were the most easily sold pieces. Grandma had been being quietly stripped for years. That was the part that made me furious in a colder, deeper way than before. It was one thing for my parents to act entitled about one necklace. It was another to realize they had likely been helping themselves to pieces of family history while pretending to be caretakers of the family legacy. The attorney told me the estate could pursue recovery if we could prove possession or sale. That is where the old records Denise had saved became priceless. She had kept photographs, appraisal sheets, and a handwritten inventory from when Grandma first moved into assisted living. Using that, the attorney traced several missing pieces to my parents through old pawn records and insurance adjustments. I did not personally enjoy any of that work. I hated every spreadsheet, every receipt, every ugly little proof of greed. But the trail was there, and once we started pulling, it kept coming. My mother had not just stolen one necklace in a moment of panic. She had been part of a slow family siphon. It was easier to forgive a single ugly act. It was much harder to forgive a pattern. The 10th major revelation came from a source I never expected. My Uncle Raymond, who had barely spoken to the family in years, called me after hearing the wedding was off. He said he had something Grandma wanted me to know if things ever got bad. He had been given a sealed note before she died, but he had only been told to share it if the family started fighting over the necklace. He mailed it to me. The note took 3 days to arrive. By then I was exhausted enough that opening it felt like doing violence to my own nerves. Inside, Grandma wrote that she had once considered leaving the necklace to Cassie, but changed her mind after watching how Cassie treated people when she thought she was owed something. She wrote that my mother had made the mistake of believing sentiment could be traded for obedience. She also wrote that my father had known the family's finances were shaky long before he admitted it. Then she wrote something that made me sit down hard. She said the necklace had belonged to her mother, who had received it from a woman who survived by hiding valuables from relatives who believed daughters deserved less protection than sons. The line that followed was the real punch. Grandma wrote that she had left it to me because I was the only person in the family who never tried to decide someone else's worth based on whether they were useful. I read that sentence about 20 times. It reframed everything. My parents had not just wanted the necklace because it was pretty. They wanted it because they saw me as the safe, obedient one, the person who would carry the burden and keep quiet. They assumed Cassie should have the visible things because she was a daughter, and I should have the invisible responsibilities because I was not. Grandma had seen the opposite. She had seen that I was the one who would actually keep her legacy intact. That made me cry again, but in a better way this time. The legal case moved slowly after that. My mother spent weeks alternately denying everything and insisting I was too angry to think clearly. My father hired a cheap lawyer who kept trying to frame the whole issue as a misunderstanding inside a grieving family. The attorney for the estate was not impressed. When the detective showed up with the chain of custody on the necklace, the receipts for the appraisals, and the safe deposit paperwork, the misunderstanding argument died pretty fast. There was enough evidence to support charges for theft and conversion. There was enough pressure from the estate to force repayment for the other items. There was enough embarrassment in the extended family that people started telling the truth in whispers. That is when I learned how many relatives had actually known things were off. A cousin admitted my mother had once tried to borrow money against a ring from Grandma's jewelry box. An aunt admitted my father had casually mentioned selling some silver to cover a temporary shortfall. A family friend who had helped with estate cleanout admitted my sister had been asking for the most valuable pieces in a way that made everyone uncomfortable. Nobody had stepped in because the behavior had been normalized for so long. That was the part I could not stop thinking about. They had built a family culture where taking from Grandma was just called helping, where a daughter being prettier in a necklace was enough reason to override a will, where my role was supposed to be silence. I did not want that role anymore. By the time the preliminary hearing happened, my parents were no longer speaking to me except through attorneys and bitter messages sent via relatives. Cassie did not go to the hearing. She could not bear to be seen tied to the theft, not publicly. That did not stop her from blaming me privately. A mutual cousin forwarded me a message where Cassie had claimed I was obsessed with a dead woman's jewelry and had destroyed her life over a misunderstanding. I stared at that for a long time and realized something important. She really believed that, not because it was true, but because that was how she had learned to survive in the family. If she could frame every consequence as someone else's fault, then she never had to deal with what she had done. The hearing itself was not dramatic in the way television would make it. There was no shouting. There was no last-second confession. It was just paper, testimony, and the kind of quiet confirmation that makes liars look smaller than they imagined. The judge reviewed the will, the codicils, and the inventory. The estate attorney laid out the theft. The detective described the chain of recovery. My father sat there with the hollow look of a man watching his shortcuts become evidence. My mother looked furious that the system was taking us seriously. I remember thinking that she had probably assumed the whole thing would stay a family matter forever. That was her mistake. Family matters thrive on shame. Courts do not. The judge ordered the necklace returned to me permanently, with no right of interference from any family member. He also allowed the estate to move forward with claims against my parents for the other items that had been sold or pledged. That was the first real justice I had seen in years. It did not feel triumphant. It felt clean. There is a difference. After the hearing, my father tried to approach me in the hallway. He looked older than he had a month earlier. He tried to frame it as a temporary bad judgment call. He said everybody was under stress. He said family had to stick together. He said he hoped I would not let this destroy what was left. I almost laughed. What was left was already destroyed by the time he said that. It had been destroyed the moment Grandma realized she could not trust them. It had been destroyed by years of favoritism, quiet theft, and the assumption that I would absorb whatever was too inconvenient for Cassie. I walked away without answering him. That felt like a victory all by itself. The aftermath came in layers. Cassie lost the engagement. My father lost a major client once the business issues became harder to hide. My mother had to explain to relatives why pieces of Grandma's jewelry were suddenly missing from the estate inventory. The family gathering stopped. Not elegantly, not with closure, they just stopped. People found excuses not to include us. Then they found excuses not to include Cassie. Then they found excuses not to ask questions. I became, for a while, the person everybody wanted to speak to privately but not publicly. That was exhausting. Denise was the only one who kept showing up consistently. She helped me sort through the remaining safe deposit contents. She helped me make sure the recovered pieces were documented correctly. She also helped me understand that closure was not going to come from my parents admitting what they did. That part never happened. If anything, they doubled down in smaller ways. My mother sent one last message saying I had embarrassed her enough for one lifetime. My father tried to mail me a check for a tiny fraction of the recovered appraisal value, as if money could retroactively erase theft. I returned it unopened. Cassie sent a note through a cousin saying she hoped I would someday understand how badly I had hurt her. That one honestly made me laugh. She had a talent for centering herself in every disaster. There was one more twist, though, and it was the one that mattered most to me. A few weeks after everything settled, the estate lawyer called and asked me to come by because the restorer had found something inside the necklace clasp. I thought maybe it was just damage from the pawn process. It was not. There was a tiny folded strip of paper inside a hidden compartment in the setting. I had no idea the necklace even had one. The note was older than Grandma's handwriting, probably copied from her mother or tucked in later from one generation to another. It said that a family keepsake is only safe when the person holding it understands that safety is not the same as ownership. I sat in my car outside the lawyer's office after reading that and just breathed for a long time, because that was the whole story of my family in one sentence. My parents thought ownership gave them the right to decide everything. Cassie thought being the daughter gave her the right to take. Grandma had left the necklace to me because she understood I would treat safety like responsibility instead of entitlement. That is what finally made the whole thing make sense. I did not keep the necklace in a drawer after that. I had it professionally cleaned and restored. I bought a small lockbox with a better security system. Then, at the suggestion of Denise, I had a replica of Grandma's note placed with it so I would not forget why it mattered. I only wore the necklace once in public, to Grandma's grave on the first anniversary of her death after everything came out. It felt strange and comforting at the same time, not flashy, not triumphant, just right. As for my family, the distance became permanent. My father eventually sold part of the business and moved into a smaller place. My mother spent a long time telling relatives I had overreacted, but enough people knew the truth that the story never fully settled in her favor. Cassie ended up with the kind of silence she had always mistaken for admiration. That is probably the cruelest thing I can say about her, and I still do not say it lightly. She was not evil in some theatrical way. She was just spoiled, enabled, and trained to think that being a daughter meant being owed softness no matter how she behaved. The worst part was that I used to feel sorry for her. Now I mostly feel sad that she never learned the difference between being loved and being indulged. I still think about Grandma a lot. I think about how she must have sat in that quiet lawyer office deciding what was safe, what was not, and who in the family would actually protect something precious. I think about how she saw through all of us. I think about how she left me a necklace, but really she left me proof that I was not crazy for refusing to surrender myself just because my family said it was easier. The final thing I learned came from Denise months later. She told me Grandma had been asked, not long before she died, why she did not leave the necklace to Cassie. She said Grandma answered that the person who loves a thing only when everybody is watching does not really love it. That hit me harder than I expected, because that was Cassie in one sentence, and it was my parents too in their own way. They loved family history as long as it made them look good. They loved tradition as long as it rewarded the person they favored. They loved me when I was useful and quiet. They loved me least when I acted like I had a right to say no. So no, I did not hand over the heirloom because it looked better on a daughter. I kept the heirloom because Grandma left it to me for a reason, and because by the time my family finished showing me who they were, I finally believed her. That ended up being the real inheritance, not the necklace, not the money, not the legal victory. It was the first time I chose my own boundary over their comfort and did not apologize for it. And honestly, I think Grandma would have liked that better than anything else I could have done.